There was no gunfire in the streets of Kampala, no tanks rolling through the capital, no dramatic announcement suspending the constitution. And yet, something profound has changed in Uganda. What if the most effective takeovers do not arrive with violence but with patience? What if power does not need to be seized in a single night, but slowly absorbed, institution by institution, until no one remembers when it happened? Uganda's story is not about a sudden collapse. It is about a silent, gradual takeover, one that unfolded over decades through the steady expansion of military influence and the quiet reshaping of state institutions. Courts continued to function. Elections were still held. Parliament still met. On the surface, everything looked normal. But beneath that surface, the rules were being rewritten. Civilian authority began to blur with military command. Security logic replaced public accountability. Loyalty became more valuable than law. Over time, the lines between government and armed power faded until the two became nearly indistinguishable. This is not the story of a traditional coup. It is the story of how control can be normalized, how institutions can be reprogrammed, and how power can change hands without ever being publicly announced. In this video, we will trace how Uganda arrived at this moment, who benefited from this transformation, and why the world largely looked the other way. We will examine the long-term strategy behind the scenes, the real-life consequences for ordinary citizens, and the deeper lessons this story offers about power in the modern era. If you value in-depth analysis, real-world context, and stories that go beyond the headlines, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss the stories others hesitate to tell. This is not just about Uganda. It is about how power truly works when no one is watching. To understand how Uganda reached this moment, you have to look beyond events and focus on design. The silent takeover did not begin with a sudden decision or a single crisis. It began with a vision of permanence. President Yoweri Museveni did not approach leadership as a temporary responsibility measured in election cycles. From the earliest years of his rule, power was treated as something to be secured, protected, and carefully structured so that it could not easily slip away. At first, the system still resembled a conventional republic. Institutions existed, elections were held, and constitutional limits appeared intact. But beneath the surface, a different logic was taking shape. Museveni understood that power rarely collapses because of public opinion alone. It collapses when systems allow alternatives to emerge. His strategy was not to openly abolish those systems, but to reshape them until they could no longer function independently. The first changes were subtle. Term limits, once designed to ensure leadership renewal, were reframed as obstacles to stability. The language shifted from democratic restraint to national continuity. When those limits were removed, it was presented not as a rupture, but as a necessary adjustment, something done in the name of experience and security. The same pattern followed with age limits. Rather than being debated as a safeguard against permanent rule, they were recast as arbitrary barriers that excluded capable leadership. Each amendment appeared isolated. Each vote looked procedural. Yet together, they formed a clear trajectory. As constitutional guardrails weakened, checks and balances did not disappear. They were absorbed. Parliament continued to pass laws, but its role gradually shifted from oversight to validation. Courts continued to operate, but their independence narrowed as politically sensitive cases faded into delays or technical dismissals. Oversight bodies remained in place, yet their authority increasingly depended on alignment rather than accountability. The structure of democracy remained standing, but its function quietly changed. What made this transformation effective was its patience. Nothing moved faster than public attention could tolerate. There were no dramatic moments demanding mass outrage, only incremental steps that felt manageable in isolation. By the time patterns became visible, they were already entrenched. Power no longer flowed through institutions as competing forces. It circulated within a closed system designed to reinforce itself. This system was not built solely through law, but through relationships. Loyalty became the currency that mattered most. Appointments favored those who owed their careers to the presidency rather than to independent merit. Over time, institutional memory shifted. Officials learned that advancement depended less on questioning authority and more on maintaining alignment. In such an environment, restraint does not need to be enforced aggressively. It becomes internalized. What emerged was not an outright dictatorship, but something more durable. A system where leadership change remained theoretically possible but practically unreachable. Elections still occurred, yet their outcomes became increasingly predictable. Opposition was not eliminated outright. It was gradually constrained, redirected, and neutralized by rules that appeared neutral on paper but decisive in practice. This is how permanence is engineered, not by closing doors, but by narrowing corridors, not by silencing every voice, but by ensuring that no alternative path can gather enough momentum to matter. Uganda's transformation did not rely on fear alone. It relied on structure. And once structure replaces choice, power no longer needs to be seized. It simply remains where it has been carefully designed to stay. As constitutional limits weakened and political power settled into permanence, the next shift did not announce itself with force. It arrived quietly, through appointments, reshuffles, and justifications framed as efficiency and stability. The transformation of Uganda did not depend on replacing civilian government overnight. Instead, civilian institutions were steadily absorbed by the military, until the difference between the two became increasingly difficult to define. At first, the presence of uniformed officers in civilian spaces seemed practical rather than political. Former commanders were appointed to oversee revenue collection, logistics, and infrastructure, praised for their discipline and ability to manage complex systems. In a country long accustomed to security challenges, this arrangement was presented as a solution, not a warning. The language used was reassuring. Professionalism, order, national interest. Yet behind those words, the balance of authority was quietly shifting. Once military figures entered civilian institutions, they did not operate as ordinary administrators. They brought with them a different logic of governance. Decisions were no longer shaped by debate or public accountability, but by hierarchy and command. Meetings began to resemble briefings. Policy discussions turned into directives. The chain of accountability, once rooted in law and procedure, gradually aligned itself with rank and loyalty. Civil servants learned to adapt. Those who resisted found themselves sidelined, while those who complied advanced. This process unfolded across sectors that rarely attract public attention. Taxation, once a technical matter of revenue and compliance, became infused with security logic. Control over financial flows meant control over political space. Elections, still publicly described as civilian exercises, increasingly relied on security coordination that blurred oversight. Local governments found themselves sharing authority with officers whose influence did not come from voters, but from command structures that extended far beyond the district level. Public administration, the everyday machinery of the state, changed in tone. Institutions that once answered to ministers and legal frameworks began answering to individuals whose authority was informal yet unquestionable. This was not about soldiers enforcing policy at gunpoint. It was about presence. When a military figure occupies a civilian office, their authority does not need to be asserted. It is assumed, and once assumed, it reshapes behavior long before it reshapes law. What made this absorption so effective was its gradual nature. There was no single moment when the military took over civilian governance. Instead, each appointment appeared isolated, justified by circumstance, but over time, a pattern emerged. Key nodes of the state were no longer independent of military influence. They were interconnected through shared backgrounds, shared loyalties, and shared expectations of obedience. As this structure expanded, civilian oversight did not collapse. It thinned. Rules remained in place, but their enforcement became selective. Institutions continued to exist, but their autonomy narrowed. The state did not become openly militarized in appearance. It became militarized in function. Governance began to prioritize control over consent, predictability over participation, stability over accountability. In such an environment, power no longer needed to declare itself. It operated through routines. The military did not replace the state. It merged with it, and once that merger was complete, the question of who governed Uganda became less about titles and more about influence. Authority flowed through uniforms even when no uniform was visible. Shaping decisions, silencing resistance, and reinforcing a system designed not for transition, but for endurance. This was not an accident. It was the logical extension of a system built to preserve control. When institutions meant to serve the public are absorbed into a security framework, governance stops being a negotiation. It becomes an order, and by the time that order feels normal, the space for alternatives has already disappeared. As civilian institutions absorbed military influence and constitutional safeguards grew weaker, another layer of the system was quietly tested. This phase did not rely on force or public declarations. It relied on familiarity. Power began to circulate within a smaller, more personal circle, where trust was defined not by law or office, but by blood and shared history. What emerged was not an abrupt shift to family rule, but a careful normalization of it. The earliest appointments involving relatives were framed as coincidence or competence. Family members were introduced into sensitive roles with titles that appeared technical rather than political. Each placement came with a plausible explanation. Experience, loyalty, reliability. Individually, none of these decisions seemed extraordinary. But together, they formed a pattern that revealed a deeper strategy. The system was being tested to see whether allegiance to the Museveni name could replace allegiance to the Constitution without triggering resistance. What followed was revealing. There was no institutional pushback, no meaningful challenge from oversight bodies, no sustained public debate capable of slowing the process. Each successful appointment became proof of concept. If the system accepted one relative, it could accept another. And with every confirmation, the boundaries of what was considered normal shifted slightly outward. Over time, these family-linked figures became more than participants in the system. They became anchors of it. Their authority did not come solely from their official roles, but from their proximity to the center of power. Decisions made in ministries, security agencies, and state-linked enterprises increasingly reflected an unspoken understanding. Loyalty to the family was loyalty to the state. Questioning one meant risking the other. This shift had a profound effect on institutional culture. Civil servants learned that neutrality was no longer enough to advance, or even to remain secure. It was safer to align with individuals whose power was permanent rather than procedural. The Constitution still existed as a document, but its role as the ultimate reference point began to fade. In its place emerged a more practical guide to survival, proximity to the ruling family. What made this transformation especially durable was its invisibility. There was no public announcement declaring dynastic rule, no constitutional amendment spelling it out. Instead, it became embedded in everyday governance. Invitations, promotions, approvals, and protections all began to follow an unwritten logic that favored personal loyalty over institutional independence. Those outside the circle could still function, but only within limits they did not control. As this model solidified, it created a self-reinforcing system. Family members in key positions protected one another, not through formal coordination, but through shared interests. Their continued influence depended on the endurance of the system itself. In turn, the system depended on their loyalty. This mutual dependence reduced the likelihood of internal dissent and increased the cost of defection. Leaving the circle no longer meant stepping down from office. It meant stepping away from protection. Public perception adjusted accordingly. What once might have provoked concern gradually became familiar. Familiarity softened scrutiny. Familiarity bred acceptance. The extraordinary was rendered ordinary through repetition. By the time the concentration of family power became obvious, it had already been absorbed into the structure of governance. This was not a failure of institutions so much as their redirection. Rules were not erased. They were overshadowed. Procedures remained, but their outcomes became increasingly predictable. The Constitution lost its role as the ultimate arbiter, replaced by a hierarchy rooted in personal loyalty and inherited authority. In this environment, leadership ceased to be a function of mandate and became a function of continuity. Power no longer needed to justify itself through law. It justified itself through presence. And once loyalty to a name carries more weight than loyalty to a constitution. The question of who governs is answered long before any formal transition takes place. By the time family rule had been normalized and institutions had adjusted to a system built on loyalty rather than limitation, the final piece of the structure was already taking shape. The question was no longer whether power could remain within the same circle, but who would inherit it. That answer had been quietly prepared for years. General Muhoozi Kainerugaba was not positioned as a future candidate in the conventional sense. He was shaped as a successor long before the public was invited to imagine that possibility. Unlike political figures who rise through party ranks, public debate, or electoral competition, Muhoozi's path followed a different logic. His preparation unfolded largely away from public scrutiny, structured not around campaigning or persuasion, but around command and control. From an early stage, his training reflected an understanding that the system he would inherit did not depend on popular mobilization. It depended on managing power where it already resided. His education was global, deliberate, and symbolic. Rather than being trained solely within Uganda-owned military institutions, he was sent to some of the most influential military academies abroad. These were environments designed to teach more than tactics. They focused on strategy, institutional coordination, and the management of large command structures. The emphasis was not on battlefield heroics, but on understanding how authority flows through complex systems, how loyalty is maintained, and how control is exercised across multiple arms of the state. When Muhoozi returned, his rise followed a carefully measured pace. Each new appointment placed him closer to the core of power without forcing public confrontation. His roles were not ceremonial. They positioned him at the intersection of security, intelligence, and executive authority. Over time, he became visible to those who mattered most within the system. Senior officers, political elites, and international partners. This visibility was not designed to win public affection. It was designed to establish inevitability. What distinguished Muhoozi's ascent was not speed, but insulation. He did not need to build an independent political base, because the system itself had already been aligned in his favor. The institutions that might normally challenge a rising figure had been reshaped long before his arrival. Civilian oversight had weakened. Military influence had expanded. Family loyalty had become normalized. In that environment, his authority did not need to be earned through competition. It was recognized through placement. As his profile grew, so did the clarity of his role. Promotions carried meaning beyond rank. They signaled trust, continuity, and endorsement from the highest level. Each step reinforced the message that he was not merely an officer advancing through merit, but a central figure within a long-term design. To supporters within the system, his rise represented stability. To critics, it suggested that outcomes had already been decided. This form of grooming was not about preparing a leader to face uncertainty. It was about eliminating uncertainty altogether. By the time Muhoozi began to occupy the highest levels of military command, the surrounding structures had already been conditioned to accept him. Resistance was not openly suppressed. It was rendered impractical. Alternatives existed in theory, but not in function. In this context, the idea of electoral competition became secondary. Elections could still take place. Debates could still be held. But they no longer served as the primary mechanism for determining leadership. Power had shifted upstream, into institutions shaped to endure beyond individual terms. Muhoozi's role within that framework was not to persuade the public, but to assume command of a system designed for continuity. His preparation reflects a broader truth about how modern authority can be transferred without spectacle. Succession does not always require a vote or a declaration. Sometimes it requires only time, structure, and the careful alignment of loyalty. By the time the question of leadership reaches the public stage, the answer has already been embedded deep within the machinery of the state. As the architecture of succession took shape and military loyalty replaced institutional neutrality, one unit came to embody the quiet transformation of power more clearly than any constitutional amendment ever could. The Special Forces Command did not emerge as an ordinary security formation. It was built as a center of gravity, a structure within the state that answered upward rather than outward, designed to protect not just territory, but continuity. Officially, the SEFCA existed to safeguard strategic sites and national leadership. In practice, it evolved into something far more consequential. Unlike conventional military branches that operate within a defined chain of command and under formal civilian oversight, the SEFCA's loyalty flowed directly to the presidency. This distinction mattered. It meant decisions were not filtered through institutions meant to balance authority. They moved through personal trust, proximity, and alignment with the executive center of power. Over time, the SEFT became a state within the state, not by announcing itself as such, but by steadily expanding its presence into sensitive areas. Its role was visible at key moments of political tension, yet its influence extended well beyond public view. Strategic locations. Critical infrastructure, and moments of national uncertainty increasingly fell under its protection. The message was subtle but unmistakable. Real security no longer depended on institutions. It depended on a force designed to be loyal above all else. What made the SEFCA particularly effective was its insulation. Civilian oversight mechanisms existed on paper, but they rarely reached into its operations. Parliamentary scrutiny remained limited. Judicial review was distant. Budgetary transparency was minimal. This absence of oversight was not accidental. It ensured flexibility, speed, and discretion, qualities valued in a unit meant to respond directly to executive priorities rather than public accountability. As other civilian institutions weakened or became absorbed into the logic of militarization, the SEFC stood apart as the most trusted instrument of authority. Its commanders were not just officers. They were confidants. Appointments within the unit reflected relationships rather than rotations. Loyalty was not assumed. It was verified. In this environment, professionalism and allegiance became inseparable. The existence of such a parallel structure reshaped how power was perceived across the state. Other institutions adapted accordingly. Officials learned where influence truly resided. Decisions began to anticipate the preferences of the security core rather than the formal rules of governance. This did not require overt pressure. The presence of an unaccountable force at the center of power was enough to encourage caution, compliance, and self-censorship. Crucially, The CEFI did not replace the national army. It complemented it in a way that altered internal balance. The broader military remained important, but it no longer monopolized force. Authority was concentrated in a smaller, more trusted unit whose purpose was not national defense in the traditional sense, but regime stability. This separation ensured that even within the security sector, loyalty could be managed and compartmentalized. As succession planning advanced and new figures were elevated within the command structure, the CEFT became a bridge between present control and future continuity. It provided assurance that transitions, should they occur, would remain orderly and predictable, not because of public consent, but because the instruments of control were already aligned. From the outside, Uganda still appeared to function as a conventional state. Ministries operated. Elections were held. Courts issued rulings. But beneath that surface, the CEFCI represented the final safeguard of the system that had been carefully constructed over decades. It was the guarantee that power, once secured, would not drift. This is how parallel power structures operate in modern governance. They do not abolish institutions, they overshadow them. By the time their influence becomes widely understood, they are no longer an exception. They are the foundation. Once the structures of power had been secured through institutions, loyalty, and command, a new arena emerged where authority could be tested without formal consequence. It was not parliament or the courts, but the public space of social media. In this space, General Muhoozi Kainerugaba revealed another dimension of how power now functioned in Uganda. His online presence was not casual or impulsive. It followed the same logic that had shaped the system around him. Demonstrate reach. Test boundaries. And observe the absence of restraint. Unlike traditional officials who speak through carefully filtered statements, Muhoozi communicated directly, bypassing diplomatic language and institutional protocols. His messages traveled instantly, crossing borders and reaching audiences that official channels often avoid. This directness created uncertainty. Observers could not easily tell whether his words reflected personal opinion, strategic signaling, or something more deliberate. That ambiguity was precisely what made the messages effective. In a system where consequences are unevenly applied, uncertainty becomes a tool of dominance. Each controversial post functioned like a stress test. Domestic critics reacted with alarm. International observers expressed concern. Yet nothing followed. No formal rebuke carried weight. No institutional correction appeared. The silence that followed was louder than any statement. It communicated a simple truth. There were no visible limits to what could be said, and no clear cost for saying it. Over time, that pattern reshaped expectations. If such messages could circulate freely without consequence, then the authority behind them was already assumed. What made this moment significant was not the content of any single post, but the environment in which they existed. The same system that had absorbed civilian institutions, centralized military loyalty, and normalized family rule now revealed its tolerance for unrestrained signaling. Social media became an extension of power rather than a risk to it. The platforms that once empowered dissent were repurposed to project confidence and control. This public display served multiple audiences at once. To supporters within the system, it reinforced the image of strength and fearlessness. To critics, it suggested vulnerability without protection. To external actors, it blurred the line between official policy and personal voice, making response more difficult. When messages appear unofficial yet go unpunished, they occupy a space that institutions are not designed to manage. The absence of accountability was the message. In states where institutions function independently, such behavior would provoke correction, clarification, or distance. In Uganda's case, the lack of response confirmed alignment, signaled that Muhoozi was not operating outside the system, but within its protection. The silence from above was not indifference. It was endorsement through inaction. This dynamic also reflected how succession had already been internalized. Muhoozi did not need to demonstrate restraint to gain legitimacy. His legitimacy flowed from proximity to power, not public approval. By testing boundaries openly and facing no resistance, he demonstrated readiness for a system where authority is asserted rather than negotiated. Social media, in this context, became a proving ground. It allowed him to project influence without holding office, to shape narratives without debate, and to signal resolve without institutional constraint. Each reaction, each headline, and each unanswered concern reinforced the same conclusion. Power was already concentrated, and it was comfortable being visible. The broader system adapted accordingly. Journalists exercised caution. Officials avoided confrontation. Public discussion shifted from questioning substance to interpreting signals. This is how intimidation works in modern governance. Not through force, but through predictability. When people know that certain figures operate beyond consequence, behavior adjusts automatically. In the end, Muhoozi's online presence was not an anomaly. It was a reflection of the structure that had been built around him. Institutions had been weakened. Oversight had been sidelined. Loyalty had replaced limitation. In such an environment, words do not need to be enforced to be powerful. They simply need to be spoken and left unanswered. As this story reaches its final chapter, the picture that emerges is not defined by a single election or a single leader, but by a system that has been carefully shaped to endure. Over time, opposition has not simply been defeated at the ballot box. It has been narrowed, pressured, and discouraged through an atmosphere where uncertainty carries consequences. Fear does not always announce itself loudly. Often, it works quietly. Through surveillance, selective enforcement, and the knowledge that some voices carry more protection than others. In such an environment, elections risk losing their original purpose. They remain visible, organized, and procedural, yet their outcome begins to feel increasingly predetermined. The rituals of democracy continue, but the space for genuine competition steadily contracts. By the time citizens are asked to vote, the most decisive choices may already have been made elsewhere, inside institutions aligned not with neutrality, but with permanence. The approach of the 2026 election reflects this reality. On the surface, it appears as another milestone in a long political timeline. Beneath that surface, it risks becoming a confirmation rather than a contest. When opposition figures face constant pressure, when civic space is constrained, and when security structures are deeply intertwined with political continuity, participation alone cannot guarantee meaningful change. The process moves forward, but the direction remains fixed. What makes this moment significant is not only what may happen during the election, but what it represents. It signals the formal recognition of a system that has already taken shape. A state where power is protected by militarized structures, where loyalty outweighs independence, and where leadership succession is managed rather than debated. In such a system, the ballot becomes symbolic, not transformative. Yet history shows that systems built on control rather than consent often underestimate one force: memory. People remember how institutions once functioned, how accountability once felt, and how choice once mattered. Even when public space is limited, awareness does not disappear. It waits. Stories like this matter because they preserve that memory. They connect the present to a broader understanding of how power evolves and how it can be challenged. Even when change seems distant, Uganda's story is not unique, but it is instructive. It shows how modern authority can be consolidated without dramatic ruptures, how democratic forms can remain while democratic substance fades, and how elections can survive even as choice diminishes. Understanding this process is the first step toward recognizing it elsewhere. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If you found this analysis valuable, Please support the channel by liking the video, subscribing for more in-depth stories, and sharing it with others who want to better understand how power really works behind the scenes.